Thank you, Mary Jo. It's great to have you here. Welcome. For those of you who may be attending your first LaWare Forum, or even for the old-timers, let me remind you of what we're doing here and give you a little bit of history of the forum. In 2005, Greater Boston was losing major corporate headquarters, raising concerns that we might lose the cohesive civic leadership on which healthy regions depend. In response, Kathy Minahan, who was then CEO and president of the Boston Fed, Paul Grogan, head of the Boston Foundation, and John Hamill, then board chair of Sovereign Bank, decided to test the waters for a flexible mechanism by which to convene Greater Boston's civic and business leaders. The idea was to offer a locus for dialogue about the region's challenges and opportunities grounded on solid research. The first forum in early 2006 was named in honor of an exemplary business and civic leader, John LaWare, who had passed away just a few months prior. John is best remembered for bringing together a diverse set of constituencies through a gracious and inclusive model of leadership to which we can all aspire. The John LaWare Leadership Forum has continued to be convened here at the Boston Fed under Kathy Minahan's successor, my boss, Eric Rosengren. Eric regrets that he can't be with us this morning. As you may know, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee is meeting early next week, and the days leading up to these meetings are very, very hectic for him, more hectic than the usual, but he sends his regards. So the John LaWare Leadership Forum meets roughly 3 times a year to focus on a short roster of immediate challenges. These include job growth, education and workforce development, housing, and local leadership. Not an easy list to tackle. Through this mechanism, we are able to highlight important initiatives underway locally that may benefit from greater visibility, as you'll hear about this morning. And on occasion, we have also invited leaders from other regions to share best practices with us. The John LaWare Leadership Forum and its growing list of co-sponsors has helped us to stay on the same page in understanding key issues, tracking and monitoring progress on these topics, celebrating success when it occurs, and addressing roadblocks as necessary. So on behalf of the Boston Fed, the John LaWare Leadership Forum, welcome and thank you for being here this morning. Now I'm going to switch hats, and I'm going to go into my day job, and I hope, yes. So the first presentation you'll be hearing this morning is by my colleague, Robert Clifford. And we're going to start with some data, some hard facts on labor market trends in the Boston metro region. Before Robert starts, I just wanted to give you some context for this. My organization, the New England Public Policy Center, promotes better policy in New England through our objective research and analysis of local issues. About a year and a half ago, we entered into conversations with Nancy Snyder and the Commonwealth Corporation about some of the challenges and opportunities faced by workforce investment boards, education leaders, and local businesses as they try to align their agendas, which is so terribly important. We became convinced that these groups lacked the hard information that they needed to meet their objectives. And one way I like to describe the Policy Center is by saying that we fill the gap, or we try to fill the gap, between what economists do and what policymakers and practitioners need. And through these conversations with Nancy and her team, we became convinced that there was a gap in knowledge and that the Policy Center could help fill it. So this has been a long and ambitious project, and it's still going on. What we have done to date is produced reports analyzing labor market trends for 8 Massachusetts regions. Actually, we've produced 7. The 8th is at the printer. And we've presented this information at regional forums that ComCorp has organized for us. So it's given us the vital audience that needs to become acquainted with the hard data. And I'm proud to say that adding up the 7 summits to date, we've had about 1,000 people attending them across the state, and more to come. We're still meeting with small groups who need individual briefings on the data. We're continuing the conversation, and we are looking forward to the statewide summit that ComCorp will be convening in February. So all of this, you'll be getting just a glimpse of this today, but all of the information is available on our website in gory detail, but we hope in an accessible form. So today our focus is on the Boston area. Metro Boston is what we're calling it. In our reports, Metro Boston actually was divided up into 4 subregions. The Northeast, which is that dark area, darkest area, Boston Metro North, Metro Southwest, and Southeast. So we did individual reports, individual summits for each of these 4 areas. Today is our first attempt at sort of combining them, comparing and contrasting the challenges in these parts of Metro Boston. And just to remind you, obviously, this is an important part of the state. It accounts for about 75% or so of the state's employment and population, and we need to understand it better. So with that, I am going to hand it over to the primary author and my workhorse colleague, Robert Clifford. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you to the LaWare Forum for giving me the opportunity to present the labor market profiles. Just adjust this. There we go. So today, I'll be going over the regions for the Boston Metro North, the Metro Boston area. And this is really the first opportunity in terms of which we've been thinking about the comparisons of trends across the regions instead of being siloed into thinking about how one region compares to state trends. So it really is a good opportunity to get our feet wet in terms of how we compare these regions, what consistent policy challenges are facing them, and what differences may exist. Today I'll be going over, I'll be breaking the data into 4 sections. I'll begin first with a discussion of the labor market performance data people are most familiar with, employment and unemployment data for some context in thinking about labor supply and demand trends. Then we'll turn to the bulk of information in the profiles in the labor supply and demand, looking at demographics and employment characteristics. And then we'll finish with a discussion of post-secondary education supply in the region. And you'll see as why we get to this point, because throughout the presentation I'll emphasize really the need for post-secondary education for employment in such a very high-skilled labor market. So to begin, we'll talk about the labor market performance. Now, here, this is not new information for anyone in the room. This is just the employment situation over the course of the last decade. As you can see, we've gone through 2 recessions nationwide. And at the start of the decade, there was the tech bubble that hurt Massachusetts in particular, at a fairly steep decline in employment. The Boston metro area, which is the combination of Boston, Cambridge, Quincy NECTA, and the New Bedford NECTA. So this contains a little bit of New Hampshire, but for the most part covers the region we're looking at. Experienced a steep decline in employment, as well hit in areas such as information, professional and technical services, as well as financial activity. The recovery from this recession was fairly slow in the region and actually did not gain back the jobs lost entering the Great Recession. And if you look at the national situation, it was more of a shallow employment loss with strong employment gains prior to the Great Recession. Now, as we all know, the Great Recession was more severe nationwide. We see the steep decline in employment, about 6.3% from peak to trough. That's a loss of 8.6 million jobs. In Massachusetts, the decline was slightly less severe, but still severe, 4.2%, a decline of about 139,000 jobs, while Metro Boston declined around 4%. That's around 103,000 jobs lost. But now, if we turn our attention to what occurred in the recovery, we see the recovery in Boston, Metro Boston and Massachusetts started a little bit earlier, was fairly strong through most of 2010 and 2011. There was a bit of a lull in mid to late 2011, but the recovery started to continue. And then you see that Boston Metro North actually comes above Massachusetts, or Metro Boston goes above Massachusetts over this time period, particularly in the recent quarters as Massachusetts started to level out in job gains, and the job gains have been concentrated more in these the eastern labor markets. But what actually was going on in these regions? So in the profiles, we use the ES202, or the non-seasonally adjusted employment data by workforce investment area. And what we see is, well, Boston Metro North is really the major driver of employment, for about 40% of the region's employment. And the Boston Metro North region experienced a severe contraction during the period preceding the Great Recession. They were hit fairly hard by the tech bubble and had a fairly slow recovery. If you look at the Northeast, that region experienced a similar trend, but this is actually due to losses in sectors such as manufacturing, which is very important to the region. And then the Southeast is on the other end of the spectrum, where they actually gained jobs over this time period. They weren't really hit as hard by the tech bubble. And then the recovery over this time period was slightly stronger, started at an earlier rate. And so they actually gained jobs following that recession, entering the Great Recession. Now, in the Great Recession, the Southeast was the hardest hit region. Actually, the second hardest hit region statewide of all the regional labor markets, experienced a severe contraction in employment almost equal to the national job losses, and not even close to what occurred in the other regional labor markets. Then if you look at the recovery, the basic story is the Southeast has lagged, while areas like the Northeast, Boston Metro North, and Metro Southwest led the way for the state in terms of job gains, with the Northeast gaining 3.6%. I could present you with a number of information on industry trends as well, which we present for each of the regions in the profiles, but just to hit some of the basic points so we can get to actually the core of the regional labor market profiles. Manufacturing is one of the industries that's seen some of the steepest declines over the course of the last decade, declined by roughly 40% across most of these regions in Metro Boston, and through the end of the Great Recession, so from the start of the decade to the end of the Great Recession. And in certain regions like the Northeast and Southeast, we've started to see a recovery in manufacturing employment, while Boston Metro North has been more stable, and Metro Southwest has actually continued to lose jobs in the manufacturing sector. Now, in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest, we are seeing job growth in these highly skilled industries, such as information and professional and technical services in recent quarters. And it's really been accelerating the state growth in these industries, as these count for major shares of the state's employment in the professional and technical services information areas. Some of the more consistent trends across the regions, healthcare and social assistance has accounted for a large chunk of the job growth in all of the regional labor markets, and has really been a major job creator over the course of the last decade in Massachusetts. And then some of the more recent trends that we're seeing, things like accommodation and food services, particularly restaurants in Boston Metro North, and administration and employment services. Largely temp employment agencies have been accounting for large chunks of, are some of the strongest employment gains across industries to date in the recovery. Now, that was more just to set the stage for looking at what the difference in occupation, our industry concentrations are across the regions. So if we look at the industry concentration by supersector, we see, well, education and health services is the largest sector of employment in every region. This is largely due to healthcare and social assistance being the largest sector of employment in every Massachusetts regional labor market. But from there, the difference really is stark. So if you look at professional and technical services, Those account for considerable shares of employment in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest, so what would be the core Boston metropolitan areas, whereas on the outskirts, the Northeast and the Southeast, there's larger concentrations in things such as trade, transportation, and utilities, particularly in the Southeast due to a large retail trade sector. Other areas, such as manufacturing, have considerable variation, where Boston Metro North employment in manufacturing is about 3.5% compared to about 14.3% in the Northeast. So if you think about what happened with this industry over the course of the last decade, though, this is actually down considerably. In the Northeast, for example, manufacturing accounted for about 20% of all employment in the region at the start of the decade, and a considerable number of jobs were lost in those areas. So there's considerable variation in terms of how sector employment or industry employment affects these regions in terms of job growth. Another trend most people are fairly familiar with, the unemployment situation in the state. So unemployment has been below the national level in both Massachusetts and Metro Boston. Metro Boston in recent years has started to dip slightly below the Massachusetts trend, as stronger job growth in the region has created a slight pull down in terms of the unemployment rate. So what we're seeing for Massachusetts in terms of unemployment is the rate in Metro Boston started about 5.8% in 4.5% in 2007, and it peaked around 8.3% in Massachusetts, while reaching only 8.1% in Metro Boston. So the number of employed in the Metro Boston area is about 200,000 individuals. But if you look across the region where the unemployment concentrations are, we see the Northeast and Southeast have the highest unemployment rates. The Southeast in particular reached the highest unemployment rate of all regional labor markets during the Great Recession at 9.6%, so that slightly exceeded the national rate in 2010. Well, Metro Southwest is on the other end of the spectrum with the lowest unemployment rate of all regional labor markets, reaching a peak of 6.4% in 2009. Now, this is a very rough way just to look at some of these trends together, but what we see is the strong employment growth of the region has really helped keep the unemployment rates below the national level over the course of the recovery. So looking at unemployment rates in October 2012, we can see that all of the regions in Metro Boston are below the national unemployment rate. If you look at the Southeast, they've had fairly slow employment growth, only 2.1%, but they're now half a percentage point below the United States in terms of unemployment. And this really conveys the connectedness of these regions in terms of commuting patterns, what you see. So we see significant flows of individuals across the borders from the Southeast to Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest. We present a number of charts on commuting patterns, or a number of figures on that. But that's roughly 170,000 residents of the Southeast working in these two fast-growing labor markets as well. The Northeast has an elevated level of unemployment, 6.6%, higher than Massachusetts, but its strong job growth has really pulled it closer to the Massachusetts unemployment rate in the last decade than we saw at peak employment levels during the recession. So that really is just some housekeeping, getting out the information most people are familiar with to turn our attention to what's going on with labor supply and labor demand trends. And what we focus on really here are age and education and some of the characteristics of the unemployed. So population growth over the course of the last decade, the region has seen some stronger population growth than Massachusetts, but Massachusetts is a fairly slow-growing state relative to the United States, so I don't know if that's necessarily something to brag about, that it grew quicker than a slow-growing state. Where we see the population growth preceding the recession was in Metro Southwest. They had fairly strong job growth, but that really dropped off in recent time period as they've lost 16 to 24-year-olds in their population, as well as seen a drop-off in the number of individuals less than age 16. So they're losing their younger age cohorts while the other regions are gaining. Another interesting trend, which I don't talk about today, but it is worthwhile looking at the profiles, is the role of immigrants and minorities in terms of population growth over the course of the last decade. So the regions that have grown tend to be the more diverse regions, as we've seen declines in the native-born and white non-Hispanic populations over the course of the last decade, and significant growth in immigrant and minority populations, most notably Hispanics, in most of the regions in the Metro Boston area. So that's really contributing to the growth here that pulls areas like Boston Metro North, the Northeast, and Southeast above statewide population growth trends. Now, the one area that people are consistently interested in looking at is what is the age of the labor force and what has been going on with the aging of the baby boomers in terms of the impact on the labor force over the course of the last decade. And Massachusetts has one of the oldest states in terms of its labor force. The share of the labor force age 45 or older makes it the 12th oldest labor force in the United States. If you compare it to all other regions, the New England states are also fairly high, with Vermont and Maine being some of the highest. And here what we're looking at is the labor force, so the folks who are employed or unemployed but actively looking for work, so an actual measure of labor supply. And what we see is that about 43% of the region's labor force is age 45 or older, but this is up from 36% at the start of the decade, and it's slightly below the 45% share of the labor force we see statewide. And as you can see, in terms of the demographic trends, we see growth of the age cohorts age 45 plus, loss of individuals age 25 to 44, and modest growth among 16 to 24-year-olds. But the interesting trend really is if you compare the regional labor markets within the Metro Boston area. And you can see significant variation. So Boston Metro North is a magnet for young professionals and really has these large shares of individuals aged 16 to 34. So you can see at 16.3%, 16 to 24-year-olds are larger than any of the other labor markets. Then 30% age 25 to 34. While that share is down slightly from 30.8% at the start of the decade, this population is actually growing. It's just their shares being crowded out by the growth in the older age cohorts. Boston Metro North was not immune to the aging demographic trends, but didn't really see them as starkly as you see in areas like Metro Southwest, the Northeast, or the Southeast. If you look at the neighbor to the west, Metro Southwest, they actually have one of the oldest labor forces in Massachusetts, with nearly 50% age 45 or older as of 2008, 2010, and steep losses in the number of 25 to 44-year-olds over the course of the last decade, where the Northeast and Southeast fall somewhat in between. Now, the reason I focus on age is this is a story that most people are familiar with as well, is related to unemployment. The younger age cohorts tend to be disproportionately represented among the unemployed. So here is a unemployment rate using census data, which isn't necessarily the best source for creating for calculating the unemployment rate, but what it essentially shows is that 16 to 24-year-olds in every regional labor market have the highest unemployment rate. This ranges from 11% in Metro Southwest to a high of 19% in the Southeast. And in Massachusetts as a whole, it sits around 16% for 16 to 24-year-olds. And in comparison to nearly every other age cohort, that's double the unemployment rates for the other age groups in the state and in these regional labor markets. So the young are disproportionately unemployed, and Boston Metro North in particular accounts for a large share of the young individuals in the state, as well as the Metro Boston region as a whole. Now, educational attainment is another area folks are consistently interested in looking at. If we look at Metro Boston as a region, we see it's more highly educated than Massachusetts. So Massachusetts is the most educated state in the United States, with 41% of the labor force having a bachelor's degree or higher. This only lags the District of Columbia if you count them in terms of educational attainment. But you can see if looking at areas like middle skills, Massachusetts is lower than in the United States. And so middle skills would be folks with an associate degree, or everyone's favorite education category, some college, which includes folks with a certificate, but number of people who went to college but didn't end up completing a degree. So it's not the best way of capturing middle skills. But then you see in Boston Metro North, lower shares of such individuals are in Metro Boston. And then at the bottom end of the spectrum, those with less than a high school degree at 8.7% are actually similar to what you see in Massachusetts. So while the region is slightly more educated than Massachusetts, it still has a comparable number of folks with less than a high school degree. If we look across the regional labor markets, this is where the trend gets very interesting. You see that Metro Southwest is actually the most educated labor market, or has the most educated labor force in the Metro Boston area. Now, this shouldn't be that surprising, given it's the I guess, wealthier or richer suburb of the Boston metro area, where a lot of folks are living in the Metro Southwest region but commuting into Boston Metro North for work. So once again, this relates to the connectedness of all these regional labor markets. But nearly 60% of its labor force has a bachelor's degree or higher. Boston Metro North is slightly behind, but around 48%, still a very highly skilled labor force. And then if we turn our attention to the Northeast and Southeast, we see that those are fairly well educated with considerable shares with bachelor's degree or higher, but it's really that middle skill cohort that's very large in these regions, with 8.8% of the Northeast and 9.6% of the Southeast having an associate degrees, and around 20% having that some college, including certificate category. At the lower end of the spectrum, I also think it's interesting if you look at the share of the population with a high school degree at 10%, in Boston Metro North. That's higher than any other regional labor market, even the Southeast, which has these large shares of folks with less than a high school degree. So while Boston Metro North is highly educated, it also has a large concentration of folks with less than a high school degree. And the reason I focus on that really relates to the unemployment rate as well again. So the unemployment rate for those with lower levels of educational attainment is higher, fairly well-known fact. But if you look at less than a high school degree, you can see the extent to which that occurs. Around 11% of individuals that are with less than a high school degree that are unemployed in the Metro Southwest, with less than a high school degree in Metro Southwest are unemployed, compared to about 21% in the Southeast. And then if you compare it to the other levels of educational attainment over this time period, you think if you're thinking about having a master's degree, you're 5 to 6 more times likely to be unemployed than those with less than a high school degree are 5 to 6 more times likely to be unemployed than those with a master's degree, and about 3 times more likely to be unemployed than those with a bachelor's degree. So educational attainment, moving folks from the less than high school to these more skilled or more readily employed positions in the region are important for employment prospects across the regional labor markets. So the basic point in the labor supply trends, just focusing on these 2 points, is really that Massachusetts as a whole is one of the older regions, has increased in age over time, and Boston Metro North is not that very far behind. Boston Metro North is the exception here in terms of the larger share of younger workers, but all the other regions are facing similar aging labor force concerns. If we look at education, it's a highly educated region, but there's still a very large concentration of individuals with less than a high school degree who face significant barriers to employment in Massachusetts in this highly skilled labor market. So turning to labor demand, we're really just focusing on the educational characteristics of the employed, and we'll use the educational attainment and composition of an industry and occupation as an example. I won't shock you with 19 occupations and 17 industries, which can be information overload. So looking at the educational attainment of the employed, we see, well, now Metro Boston is slightly more educated than Massachusetts. As was the case with the labor force, it's just a little bit starker. So 43% of Massachusetts workforce has a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 46% in the Metro Boston region. And the trends are fairly consistent in the other areas: lower levels of middle skills and declining number of individuals with a high school degree or less in Metro Boston. But now, if you look across the regional labor markets, we see Boston Metro North is actually the most highly educated workforce in the Metro Boston region, and this is really reflecting that commuter pattern. So a lot of folks from the Northeast, Southeast, and Metro Southwest commute into Boston Metro North for work. It's a major commuter magnet, not only for the region, but for all of New England. We see significant flows from New Hampshire and Rhode Island as well, and about 52%, 53% of the labor force or the workforce in Boston Metro North has a bachelor's degree or higher. The interesting trend, I think, is if you look at that middle skills group, though, the folks with associate degrees or some college, which are considerably lower in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest, but account for considerable shares of employment in the Northeast and Southeast. So 9.3% in the Northeast, 9.4% in the Southeast have an associate's degree. Around 20% with this some college, so about 30% in these two regions of their of their workforce have fall into this middle skills category. And this is interesting to me if you look across the growth. So instead of looking at share here, where has been the growth in terms of employed individuals in Massachusetts and in these regions over the course of the last decade? So what we see is bachelor's degrees and master's degrees have consistently been the strongest growing educational cohorts over the course of the last decade, growing in every single region. Those with less than a high school degree have increasingly declined among the employed in the past decade, and similarly, for high school, we see declines in most regions, the exception being a small blip in terms of Metro Southwest seeing growth, and that seems like an outlier to me. I'm not really sure what is the story behind that. But the focus here on the middle is what is the interesting story to me. So the highly skilled labor markets of Metro Southwest and Boston Metro North have declined in the number of folks with some college and associate's degrees. But if we look at the Northeast and Southeast, we see a little bit of growth in that some college category, but pretty strong growth in the number of associate degrees. So this really is reflective, I think, of the demand for high-skilled labor in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest, whereas in the Southeast and Northeast, they also have a need for these middle skill workers. And this is consistent with what you see in most other Massachusetts labor markets. You see growth in associate degrees. So Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest really the only region to see declines in the number of folks employed with these middle skills. Now, looking at educational attainment by industry, I'm going to use manufacturing as an example because this provides some good context in terms of thinking about composition and occupational mix, but it also is an industry that gets a lot of attention in recent years. So nearly half of the manufacturing in Boston Metro North has a bachelor's degree or higher. 40% in Massachusetts has a bachelor's degree or higher, but only around 25% in the United States have a bachelor's degree or higher. Now, nationwide, we see larger shares of individuals with middle skills, but still overall, it tends to be more of a low-skilled industry with folks with a high school degree or less nationwide, whereas it's somewhat of a mixed industry in Massachusetts. So we hear in regions, manufacturing sometimes has this dirty connotation, but there's a large number of high-skilled, high-end manufacturing taking place in Massachusetts. And in areas like Metro Southwest and Boston Metro North, that's even more so the case. Now, to think of what is the case here, part of this could be related to upskilling, taking advantage of the high-skilled labor supply that's available in these regions. So Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest may fill some positions with a bachelor's degree that may only require an associate's degree or in some cases a high school degree. But I think the real story comes down to composition. So if you look at where the concentration of employment of manufacturing is nationwide or even in the Southeast, you see it's in things like non-durable goods such as food, but other areas like fabricated metal, miscellaneous parts, plastics. And in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest and even the Northeast, it's in areas such as electronics, chemicals, and computers. Notably in the Northeast, semiconductors reflecting Raytheon in terms of employment. There's a large spike of employment in that area. And if you look at the educational attainment of these sub-industries, the concentrations of those in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest are these highly skilled, less labor-intensive subsectors of employment, whereas the Southeast and United States are employed in more of these low-skilled, more labor-intensive or more production-intensive industries. So another way to get at that is to think about the occupational mix and what the educational attainment looks like by occupation. So here we're just looking at production occupations, which account for the largest share of employment in manufacturing in all regions and the United States. And we see there's not really that large a difference in terms of a production employee in the United States versus a production employee in Boston Metro North. Actually, a production employee in the United States is slightly more skilled than in Boston Metro North in terms of educational attainment. So since the comparison isn't necessarily that stark, what this means to me thinking about manufacturing is what are the other occupations that are really concentrating, are accounting for large shares of employment within manufacturing. So we break that down in terms of we provide a crosstab of occupation and industry, and just looking at manufacturing and only looking at the 6 largest occupations, I've grouped all other 13 occupations that we look at into other. What we see is, well, production is the largest share of employment at 40.2% in the United States, and then the only region that's comparable is the Southeast at 40%. Massachusetts, about a third of employment in manufacturing and production, while regions like Metro Southwest are down to only 21%. In Massachusetts, we see larger shares of management and office administrative support in the manufacturing industry, but that's not necessarily that surprising since these are 2 large occupations that account for considerable shares in most industries we look at. It's really the difference that comes down to architecture and engineering and computer and mathematical occupations, which account for fairly considerable shares in Massachusetts relative to the United States, and in areas like the Metro Southwest and the Northeast, they account for very large chunks of employment. Now, Boston Metro North is actually somewhat of an outlier here. They have more manufacturing employment concentrations in areas like business and financial operations, sales, and then life and physical sciences. So it's really a very different mix, but the basic point is that these occupations, the architecture and engineering, computer and mathematics, management, are these very high-skilled parts of manufacturing, whereas there's less production-intensive work in the manufacturing industry in Massachusetts. Now, everyone should feel free to go do that for all 19 occupations and industries on their own time, as we provide all the data online. It takes a considerable amount of time in some cases. Now, the basic point of all of this so far has really been education is important. It's a pretty simple point to convey. But looking at all these different trends, we see that across regions, a post-secondary education is a pathway to employment, whether it's in the Northeast where there's middle skill employment in demand and high skill, or if there's just high skill industry concentrations as in or high skill demand in areas like Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest. So we finished the profiles by looking at where's the supply of education coming from. If we look just within, so here we'll be talking about the actual physical institution's location, not necessarily that students are living there or working there afterwards. Everyone's favorite data series, iPeds, is the source for this. And what we see is that Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest are responsible for a majority of the region's degrees and certificates, but in particular, they account for over 50%, nearly 60% of associate degrees, and 75% of the region's bachelor's degrees. Now, the certificates is the only area that we've seen considerable change over the last decade in terms of composition, with the Northeast and Southeast increasing their share of certificates, while we've seen declines in Metro Southwest and Boston Metro North. Now, the growth has really been in that certificate field in the Northeast and Southeast, with the Northeast actually growing at double the rate of Massachusetts over the course of the last decade in terms of certificate completions, and the Southeast outpacing the statewide rate as well, while Metro Southwest actually saw no growth. It was flat in terms of certificates. Boston Metro North did see considerable growth in this area as well, but lagging the other regional trends. Now, associate degrees as well grew stronger in the Northeast and Southeast, but Boston Metro North experienced a bump. Metro Southwest, once again, is the region that's lagging. And if you're looking at bachelor's degrees, the Northeast had the strongest growth, but Boston Metro North is just slightly behind at around 2.2% annual growth rate, which is quite surprising given the large number of bachelor's degrees in the region. Boston Metro North counts about 40% of all the state's bachelor's degrees, I believe. So this percent growth is still fairly strong and really driving the Massachusetts trends over the course of the last decade. Now, in the profiles, we break down the statistics by public versus private to get a sense of what type of institutions are producing these degrees. And what we really see here is that if you look at public institutions, the Southeast and the Northeast are actually the major suppliers of public education in the Metro Boston region. So around 2/3 of the certificates are coming from the Northeast and Southeast. About 60% of associate degrees are coming from these two regions, and even around 2/3 of bachelor's degrees are coming from the Northeast and Southeast. And that shouldn't be actually that surprising given the large number of public institutions in the Northeast and Southeast, while there's private institutions in Metro Southwest and Boston Metro North. If you look at the growth trends, this is similar to the story for private or all institutions. The Northeast and Southeast saw strong growth in certificates, but here the outlier really is the associate degree growth for Boston Metro North. Bunker Hill Community College nearly doubled the number of completions over the course of the last decade, and Roxbury Community College actually saw similar growth in associate degree completions. We have a number of bits of information about the fields of study in terms of where the degrees are in, but just to kind of quickly go over, get a sense of where the degrees are coming from or certificates, we see health sciences accounts for the largest share of certificates in most regions, the exception being services in Metro Southwest. And the services include things like automotive repair, HVAC, and just repair services in general, coming from a large number of public institutions like Universal Technical Institute in Norwood. If you look at associate degrees, it's a little bit more mixed. Health sciences does slightly edge out arts and humanities in the Metro Boston region, but in some areas like the Northeast, it accounts for the largest number of associate degrees, Well, in Metro Southwest, services account for the largest chunk of associate degrees, similarly in that HVAC, automotive repair, and repair areas in general. And then for bachelor's degrees, arts, humanities, and social sciences account for the largest chunk consistently across all regions. Business is shortly behind in Metro Southwest due to a large number of business schools. Babson, LaSalle, Brandeis, Boston College even is in that area. But then if you look at the next two, science and mathematics and engineering and computer science, that's really the STEM fields. And you can see Boston Metro North counts for a considerable share. That's actually the second largest share of any regional labor market in the state. It only lags, I believe, Central Mass due to Worcester Polytechnical Institute accounting for a large chunk of their bachelor's degrees. So that's a lot of information in hopefully what I think was a short time period. But the basic point from the presentation is that looking across these regions, there's significant variation, even looking at just a couple of the major trends. So Metro Southwest is one of the oldest labor forces, while Boston Metro North has one of the youngest. The Southeast has this large shares of folks with a high school degree or less. Boston Metro North has the most educated workforce. And even looking at education, you see the mix between private education in Boston Metro North and Metro Southwest, and public education in the Northeast and Southeast. But if there is some unifying themes to take away, one example is the consistent large shares of individuals who are the young and less educated among the unemployed, facing barriers to employment in all of the regional labor markets, not only in Boston Metro North, or in Metro North, in all of Massachusetts. So thank you, and with that I'm going to hand the floor over to Yolanda for the big questions.
Actually, I was tempted to pass out a pop quiz at this point. But we'll spare you. All of this information is on our website. I do want to leave this group especially with some bigger questions that we can, I hope, address both today and in the future. So looking at this, what do you think are the most challenging workforce issues in this area? And should we be thinking about all of Metro Boston as one area, or does it make sense to look individually at these 4 subregions? You saw the breakdown of degrees, health sciences, STEM, arts and humanities. Does this look like the right mix to you? And if it isn't, what needs to be done to fix the misalignment between what employers are demanding and what students are getting? And finally, I was blown away when I saw the unemployment rates for the 16 to 24-year-olds and the people without a high school diploma. These are stark, and one of the critical issues that we need to be addressing is what we can do to improve the employment prospects for the young and for the less educated. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Paul Grogan, president of the Boston Foundation, and let me just introduce the balance of the program. And I'm going to dispense, Mr. Secretary, with my customary lengthy and flattering introduction of you in the interest of time. But we're going to hear next tackle some of these big questions and some others from the administration. Secretary Bialecki, a very faithful participant in this forum over the years and a great partner of ours on so many undertakings. He'll be joined by Mary Beth Campbell, who occupies a new cross-secretariat position, attempting to unify education and workforce strategies, which I think is a very important dimension of what's being discussed. And then after that, our good friend, Professor Barry Bluestone, Dean Bluestone from Northeastern, the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, will moderate a panel, and I'll ask Barry to introduce the panelists at that time, although everybody's bio is in the packet. Mr. Secretary, with that.
Thank you, Paul, and it's good to be with you here this morning. Just a few observations to sort of tee up what you're going to be hearing from very shortly, including members of our team. First, I want to thank the Federal Reserve Bank and for all this work that has been done on understanding these regional labor markets. It's a great setup for the conversations we're going to have. From our point of view, 2 very important points. One is that Massachusetts, even though geographically we're a small state, if you look at a big map of the United States, we are, in fact, composed of pretty distinct regions with different industry clusters. There are different labor markets, and so we have found as we've tried to do the work of better understanding how to improve education, our education and workforce development systems for the sake of our regional employers, that it is in fact very important for a state like ours to look at these regional numbers and not just try to draw conclusions, often erroneous conclusions, from statewide averages. So thank you for the work, which is very important. And the other important aspect of it is it's important these days in the 21st century to be data-driven for folks in the business community, that they are obsessed by that. Everything they do in terms of their performance, their sales, their customers is focused on data. So, and that's the explosion in the information that's available and our ability to collect and analyze it. We have to take advantage of that, both because it's the right thing to do to achieve the best result, but from my point of view, also very important because to demonstrate to the business community that we are serious about taking an approach here, we have to show that we are as data-driven in the work that we are doing in education and workforce development as they are in their businesses. So you're going to hear more from Mary Beth Campbell, who works with, as Paul mentioned, for me and for Education Secretary Paul Revell and for Labor and Workforce Secretary Joanne Goldstein. She is, yes, she's a saint, it's true. And about our particulars of our program, I just want to mention briefly, I think, what the three fundamental aspects that Governor Patrick believes are important to have an effective education and workforce development system in Massachusetts. The first is simply that it ought to work like a system, which is a challenge. It's not only a challenge on the public side. We have public education, which, as you know, is primarily run by local school districts. We've got our K through 12 system. We've got our voc-tech schools. We've got our community colleges, our state universities, the UMass system, and then add onto that all the other private sector participants as well, the private colleges and universities, for-profit and nonprofit training programs, union training programs, and it's quite an extraordinary diversity of resources. That's the good news, but we are not nearly coordinated enough in having common objectives, working together, understanding who does what and who does what best, and leaving that work to others. So that's one key element that you'll hear Mary Beth talk about, and we'll talk about more this morning, is what would it look like for Massachusetts to truly have an integrated, network, coordinated public-private system of education and workforce development, and also one that is transparent to the folks who need those services in that training. So you don't have to go, if you're looking to find out how to get the skills to pursue your next job or career, you don't want to be told that there are 52 places who can help you. You want to understand who is able to help you, who's best able to help you, who is most available to you in your region, given what you can afford and to pay and so forth. So coordinated system is one. Second is we want the important characteristic that the governor and I want to see is a system that is responsive to our regional employers. And again, understanding there are different labor markets in Massachusetts. We want to respect that. But within each region, are we collecting, analyzing, evaluating the data? Are we in good relationships with the business community? Is the system thinking about how to produce the kinds of graduates that we want to fill the jobs that we have to continue to grow our economy? We don't want to do that in a narrow-minded way of today we need someone of this occupational code and tomorrow we need somebody else. We want to take a long-term view, but what are the trends in the labor market? What are the fundamental skills? We know that there's so many careers these days, even what would formerly be considered the basic job on a manufacturing shop floor requires a lot of STEM education. And so we want to make sure that we are laying that fundamental foundation. We also know that the person starting out today is not likely to have a career in one company. And so how do we prepare them for a career where they will have multiple predictable job changes? So that's the second important one. Coordinated is one, responsive to employers the third, and a second. And the third is, do we have a system that is really available and accessible and useful for all kinds of people wherever we may find them? So in other words, the model historically has been, let's a lot of our systems are built on the idea, premised on the idea that someone's going to get a good high school education, and there's certain things that we can expect, therefore, that everybody is going to have a basic skill set, a basic set of competencies. And so therefore, education and training and workforce development associated with a particular career path is more taking, how do you take a person with those fundamental competencies and how do you provide that specialized training and development? Well, it turns out that in today's workforce, we're trying to bring along and to make ready for jobs folks in all different places. We do have overall in Massachusetts a great K through 12 public education system, but there's still great disparities in that system, and that achievement gap is something that Governor Patrick's focused on. But we're finding in a lot of cases in our community college, for example, that a student who graduates with a Massachusetts high school diploma and passed the MCAS is not ready to take a full course load at a community colleges, and some of the class work that needs to be taken is remedial. So how do we think about, and so we have that for our up and coming students. We have folks who have not completed high school that we need to think about. We have folks who are, have lost their job, a lot of long-term unemployed in this recession. And that means that the folks who lost their job are probably not going to go back to the job that they had before or the kind of job they had before. They're going to need to make a career move or an occupational move. So have we built a system that, whether it's for young people, is it for young people without a work history? How do we build in an element of work experience to that fundamental foundation that we're creating, not just classroom training? So how do we design a system that doesn't provide a ladder of opportunity, but the lowest rung is one that is not accessible to the folks who most need work? And how do we make sure that that ladder reaches down and that we're able to assess and understand and evaluate and provide the programs that are necessary so that we can say, whether it's a younger person just starting a career, a mid-career person who has been forced by circumstances to change their occupation or even their industry, that we have a system that's flexible enough that it can take people where they are and can pull them up on the pathway and bring them to a place where they have the skills and training to take on a productive occupation. So those are the three basic elements that we think of what a really high-functioning Massachusetts system would look like. As I mentioned, a lot of that work is for state government to do, but not only for us. We consider the job of creating that kind of effective education and workforce development system to be truly public-private collaboration, all levels of government, and both the nonprofit, academic, and business sectors. So thank you very much. The governor, as you know, is very committed to this. I think one of the timing of this program today and this beginning of a series on education and workforce development we think is great. There have been a lot of nasty things about having a great recession. One of the challenges is that it causes everybody to become really short-term thinkers. And whether you're in government, whether you're in business, in your own household or family, everybody's worried, how am I going to get through the month? How am I going to get through the year? And we're now 3 years in to a recovery in Massachusetts and in the country. It's not as fast or strong as anybody would like, but we are there, and the governor and I strongly feel that it's important time in Massachusetts for us to lift our heads up a little bit, worry less about the day-to-day problems and go back to thinking about the long-term problems, challenges, how to make this state a better and more prosperous place over the next 10 and 20 years. You've heard us, the governor, talk about housing as a big issue, which is many folks in the room have been working on. That's something that we worried about before the Great Recession. It's time to worry about it again. It's an element of our competitiveness. And this issue today of education and workforce development, it is, now that we're becoming long-term thinkers again and revisiting these questions of how to make this state great over the next 10 and 20 years, the governor and I feel this has got to be absolutely at the top of the agenda. So thank you for the LaWare Forum for focusing on it.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Just wanted to make sure everyone's awake. My name is Mary Beth Campbell, and as one of my bosses said, I'm the Director of Education and Workforce Development, working for the Tri-Secretariat. I'm not a saint yet. I haven't performed any miracles. I think that's one of the requirements, but we're trending towards that. So I just want to be brief and try to be concise and give you sort of the macro level framework that the secretaries and I are working from in terms of how we're coordinating from the top down, and ultimately hope to steer state resources and support a statewide framework to support the good work going down on the ground and from the ground up. So you heard the secretary mention pathways, and this is really the central objective that we're using across the secretariats to illustrate our coordination in terms of promoting, building, and supporting building career pathways across our system, and aligning our systems so that we can create better linkages and more navigable systems for our students, our job seekers, and our employers. So that's our vision, our mission, and our promise in terms of what we're doing from the top down, and hopefully supporting elements of that from the bottom up. We have a sort of macro level strategy that is inclusive of 3 points to it. We're calling it a 3-point plan in terms of where we're steering our efforts and focusing our efforts. And I'm going to go through these 3 points today. And then I'll provide some illustrations that we're working in terms of discrete projects and that we're using as mechanisms to illustrate some of these critical elements. So the first will be a new committee comprised of business leadership, executive leadership from our community college system and our state university system, and leadership across our workforce investment system, including our workforce boards, labor, and nonprofit agencies that work on the ground in workforce development. And we'll be soon announcing in January at our next Mass Workforce Investment Board meeting the composition of this committee. It will sit as part of our Mass Workforce Investment Board. So for those of you that are not familiar with it, it is a large group of 65-plus people, majority comprised of business and industry. It's co-chaired by our governor and a member of our Merrimack Valley Chamber of Commerce, Joe Bialecki. And we are going to be asking the MWIB to approve this committee as part of the work that we want to focus on in terms of building career pathways. It'll be a subcommittee that will be sustained beyond, in terms of thinking of the long-term aspects of this work. Because the MWIB is a state and federally required entity, there's some sustainability in it in terms of personnel and longevity, and we thought it made a good sense to put a committee in that, given some of the precedent that has been set by good subcommittee work within that group. So this new committee will sit within this MWIB. Hopefully they'll approve this in January. And we're working in terms of building this committee and giving it a dual role. First, we'll help have the committee be our brand and our stewards of the work that we're doing in terms of looking at the work that we're doing both at the state level, but also helping us brand and steward that and facilitate our message at the local and regional level. And we'll be looking at ways in which in terms of how we're somewhat siloed and fragmented, particularly in our K-12 system in terms of building some of the career pathways across discrete mechanisms, some of which I'll discuss today, having this group help us think more comprehensively and create a more umbrella around communication and messaging in terms of how we scale and model and facilitate the direction around building career pathways as steps towards a statewide system. The second element and role of what this committee will do is really the second element of this whole strategic plan is helping us to build regional strategic planning and facilitate regional strategic planning. And that is really where I think the brunt of the work is going to be in terms of where providers and stakeholders on the ground are going to play a huge component in working with us from the top-down approach, but also implementing on the ground. We, across the state, require our workforce investment boards, our community colleges, our economic development agencies, and regional economic development organizations to do all their own strategic planning. Sometimes it happens with each other, but most often it doesn't happen together. And this is a process that we want to implement in a practice that we want to become inherent within the state. It's never been done before in terms of building statewide tools and building a statewide framework whereby we're asking stakeholders to work together in larger regions rather than in their discrete geographic areas, but bringing their resources together and leveraging their resources together in a different way in terms of how they're planning to build the talent pipeline, how they're planning long-term for the future, and discreetly building products together in terms of going after grant dollars together, building campaign and mechanisms to tout their talent pools in their region, their larger super regions, rather than just discreetly working within their own realms, but actually asking them to work together in a more consistent, comprehensive way. We see good models of that happening around the state, but it's not consistent in our historic support of a statewide framework. So we want to begin to implement that practice where we're providing statewide tools and resources and asking our stakeholders across workforce, economic development, and education to work together in a process that is more inclusive of their counterparts. So we'll be looking at the very least to ask our stakeholders, beginning for the FY14 planning process, if they look at nothing else, look at our 4 priority industry sectors across advanced manufacturing, IT, life sciences, and healthcare, but also appreciate the uniqueness and distinctions and industry priorities across regions where those 4 may not necessarily be key employment areas or trending in that area, but they have other aspects and industries that are strong in their regions, culture and arts in the Berkshires, tourism and travel in the Cape, et cetera. So asking them to identify partners that they're willing to work with, but at least create a core team where folks are working together in a consistent way. And we expect that process will evolve over time, but for the FY14 year, we want to implement, beginning in January, a process that's inclusive of the development of what we expect the practice to look like in the tools, and then have it become more robust over time in the long term, and not just for the next 2 years, but for the next 10, 20 years in terms of planning. This is sort of an example. It's more hierarchical than it ought to look, but this is an example of a product that we might anticipate replicating and scaling through regional planning, but something that we're already starting to do in anticipation of the work that we're doing across a major sector. So in advanced manufacturing, we have the Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative now codified as a result of the passage of the Jobs Bill this summer. There's work that has been ongoing since last year in this collaborative, but now it's more formalized in its efforts. And we are developing across the priorities of the Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative in terms of promoting manufacturing, supporting a talent pipeline and development across workforce and education efforts, access to capital, innovation and technology, and so on and so forth. Through the workforce and education component of this, we're looking at developing regional consortia that are representative of stakeholders across economic development, our business and industries and manufacturing, our community colleges, our vocational schools, and our workforce investment boards and one-stop career centers, bringing them together so that they become a team on the ground that is working together and collectively in terms of responding to helping build the talent and workforce needs of manufacturers in particular priority areas. We've seen some success in this in Western Mass and the Hampden County region through a program called the Precision Manufacturing Regional Alliance Project. We've also seen some good work in Central Mass through the Mass Manufacturing Extension Partnership and some work that Quinsigamond Community College and Worcester Vocational School have done together. We're looking at elements of those best practices, and we want to export them to other regions so they can import those and not reinvent the wheel, but import some of the tools and resources that we've seen work and build these consortia across the state. So in this example, we've started with the Northeast, and they've already made some progress working together across the 3 community colleges in that region, the 4 workforce investment boards and multiple vocational schools in that region. They're applying for together Workforce Competitiveness Training Fund grants that are due in January. So we're seeing progress in terms of them actually leveraging their resources at the table and planning together in terms of where each organization plays a strong role in the certification pathway for manufacturing. So this is the type of example that we'd like to see modeled and scaled across the state, and we're beginning to look at the Southeast as well and helping them develop their own consortia there too. The last piece of the puzzle and the component to system alignment is really the sausage making of all of this. Where does this get staffed and who's doing it? So we at the state level and have looked at our assets in terms of our staff and our resources, and we've brought together a group that meets every 3 weeks. It's our interagency team from across the 3 executive offices and the departments that are within those offices. And what's not actually on this list right now and should be is representation from Health and Human Services. We'll be inviting the Department of Transitional Assistance in, where they have funding that impacts workforce and education outcomes through TANF. We'll be inviting them in to be a part of this team. The team really is meant to at least be a communication tool between all of us, so we're talking regularly and sharing what we're doing as a first step, but also ultimately looking at how we're steering our state resources along the continuum in terms of our education and workforce resources, where we might be targeting gaps where we haven't historically targeted dollars, or where we might be overloading some funding and where we can spread the wealth a little bit. And also generally impacting our performance in terms of how we perform towards system alignment across our offices, but also looking at the performance criterion that we're expecting across our granting and funding resources, so there's more alignment in terms of the message and what we're trying to accomplish in our vision on the ground. So those are the three critical elements in terms of the macro level strategy that we're trying to accomplish. I'll talk just briefly about a mechanism that we're putting on the ground as what we see as a first step towards ultimately, hopefully, creating a statewide system of implementation. Last year, we joined a national network with 5 other states in partnership with Jobs for the Future and Harvard Graduate School of Education called the Pathways to Prosperity Network. And Massachusetts is taking part as a partner with our peer network in attempting to build 6-year career pathways beginning in 9th grade, 9 through 14, and including our workforce investment boards, our local high schools, and our community colleges in 3 pilot regions, looking at these 9 through 14 career models that build 6-year career pathways in sector-specific industries that lead to the attainment of a post-secondary degree or credential that has currency in the labor market and includes partners at the table that will help provide work-based and workplace experiences, internships, co-ops, and involvement at the high school and community college level, where at the end of the 6th year, students participating are employed with those partnering employers, because they've been at the beginning of the process with us starting in year 1, which we hope to implement across our 3 regions in September 2013. Those 3 regions include Boston. We're working with Bunker Hill Community College. I see Neil Sullivan here from the Boston PIC working closely with us, and Boston Public Schools to build 6-year career pathways in healthcare. Where we're working primarily right now through building one pathway through a program that Bunker Hill already has, but that has some holes in it in terms of 9th and 10th grade curriculum alignment with the community college, building off of that foundation, and hopefully also as we move forward, building other multiple career pathways in healthcare that may also expand to other colleges in the city and certainly expand across the district in Boston in terms of inclusive of high schools. So we're targeting September 2013 for year 1 of that. We're also working in Metro West, if you go a little bit farther down the pike, with Mass Bay Community College, Partnerships for a Skilled Workforce, which is the workforce investment board out in that area, and working with local high schools in Framingham, one of our vocational schools, Keefe Tech, and hopefully growing the base of high schools as we progress along the continuum here in Metro West, targeting cross-sector IT skills in this particular area, working with companies like Bose, PTC, Harvard Vanguard, and addressing some of the IT skills needs that they might have in that region. And then moving a little bit farther down the pike is in Hampden County, working with the Regional Employment Board of Hampden County and Springfield Tech, and also the Western Mass Tool and Machine Association. I mentioned the Precision Manufacturing Regional Alliance project earlier. They've done a lot of work with the 7 regional vocational schools out in that area, but even the demand, even the capacity at its fullest capacity in those 7 vocational school districts cannot meet the demand for machinists and advanced manufacturing in that area. So there's an interest in that region to also include the comprehensive high schools in terms of targeting advanced manufacturing as a career pathway from machining to all the engineering needs in between. So we're working with them now in the 40-plus companies that are involved in the Western Mass Tool Machine Association to develop those career pathways between Springfield Tech Community College and West Springfield High School for now, but we're looking to expand as we grow beyond the first year of this. So that's one illustration in terms of how we think on the ground we're representing the stakeholders that represent us in terms of from the top level down, but where the nitty-gritty work really is happening in each of these regions. And as I said before, these 3 I hesitate to call them pilots. We'd like to call them some first steps in what we might envision and aspire to be as a system-wide implementation. And also complementing some of the other career pathway work that we're doing through the administration, including our Gateway Cities agenda and building career academies that are will model the National Academy Foundation model in terms of building either school within a school or whole school models for building career pathways in our Gateway City districts and high schools there. So I'm happy to take questions, or I don't know if are we taking questions later? No? Okay, we'll just keep going. All right, very good. I'll be here all day. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Mary Beth told you about the nitty-gritty. But I think it's exciting, particularly for those of you who have been around the John LaWare Forum from the beginning, that issues that were identified by the Forum, issues that were identified here at the Fed, and issues that were identified by the Boston Foundation, as well as issues that have now been played out through our media friends at the Boston Globe, at the Herald, and at WBUR and GBH, really have led to much of the activity you see here today around housing, around local economic development, manufacturing, and all those issues and how they tie together, and then particularly workforce development. We have a wonderful panel here to add to this. I just want to let you know, though, one personal thing, and that is that I'm thrilled to let you all know that starting January 1st, I am going to be spending some time here at the Fed working on many of these issues with the Community Affairs Department. That is, if I'm able to pass A, the drug test, B, the query, the credit check, the fingerprint review, and prove that I am neither an illegal or extraterrestrial alien. But I hope to be joining folks here. We have a wonderful panel. Without further ado, I want to introduce them. You know them all very well. My dear friend Richard Freeland, my boss for many, many years at UMass Boston at Northeastern, now Chancellor of Higher Education. Brian Gilmore from the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, which we've been working with very closely, and my very dear friend Nancy Schneider from Commonwealth Corporation. Why don't we begin, Richard, with some of your comments. Keep them real short. We want to be able to have as much conversation as possible. I'm going to give each one of you 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
Thank you, Barry. Let me congratulate the Boston Foundation LaWare Forum for doing this. As Secretary Bialecki said, this is very timely, very relevant to what we're trying to accomplish at the state level, and so I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of it. The central focus of the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education in all this is quite simple. We think that Massachusetts needs the best educated citizenry and workforce in the country, full stop. We think our future depends on the quality of our workforce and the educational level of our workforce, and therefore it's our job to be part of making that happen. The question is, where is that best educated workforce going to come from? And our premise is that traditional sources of that workforce are in some ways less robust than they used to be. Our population is not growing, and migration has not been strong. We get all these terrific young people coming to our private colleges that have historically fed our workforce and still are, but less so than in the past. Many of the institutions that in the past on the private sector were major educators of our future workforce have become increasingly national and international in their focus. And in that context, the role of public higher education has become far more important. Today, Massachusetts public higher education educates 2/3 of the young people who grow up in Massachusetts and go to college in Massachusetts, and that is going to be the backbone of our future workforce. Therefore, we need a first-rate system of public higher education if we are going to have the best educated citizenry and workforce in the country. So my job as commissioner these days has been twofold. One is to sort of raise consciousness about the heightened importance of public higher education in today's world and in the future world. I think public higher education has historically been so overshadowed by our terrific private sector that we have thought we could get by with modest levels of investment. I don't think we can anymore, and I welcome the opportunity in a forum like this to try to share with you the notion that I think we all as civic leaders need to think about heightening the level of investment we're making in public higher education. And the Boston Foundation has been a great ally, I think, in sounding that alarm. But number two, we in public higher education need to be sure we are doing absolutely all we can to be the best we can be. And that is the central focus of an initiative called the Vision Project, which is driven by the notion that in a series of key metrics of performance in public higher education, we need to be the leading state in the nation. We just completed and released a study called Time to Lead, which is the first comprehensive study of how well public higher education in Massachusetts is doing compared with other states. And what we found out basically was that while there are terrific things going on all over public higher education, things that I'm very proud of, and young people all over the state are getting a terrific experience in our public institutions, on average, we're pretty average. Our metrics of performance place us squarely in the middle of the pack among the states, and that ain't good enough for Massachusetts. If we're going to have the best educated citizenry and workforce in the nation, we can't be average on every key outcome. For example, we look closely at workforce-related outcomes to come to the focus of this session. We found that we are currently underproducing in terms of the number of college graduates that the state is going to need from the public system to meet the projected need for college-educated workers over the next 5 to 10 years. We found out we're underproducing in key workforce areas like healthcare and STEM. And we found that the results of our student performance on key tests of educational achievement, professional licensure, for example, for graduates of community colleges, were solidly in the middle of the pack. A short conclusion from all this: we have a lot of work to do if we're going to be producing the best educated citizenry and workforce in the country, and that is our focus. So there are a whole bunch of initiatives going on at the college level. The community colleges, for example, have come together and gotten $20 million from the Department of Labor to strengthen their game in the whole area of workforce development. At the system level, the Vision Project is very much focused on this, and in response to questions, I'd be happy to talk. We'll see Barry looking at me here. Be happy to talk about a whole range of things we're doing. But the big story today has been, I think, the governor's focus on this through the State of the State last year, where he made this a centerpiece of his State of the State speech in January of 1912, followed it up in the fiscal 13 budget proposal with a whole series of initiatives that, together with the legislature, both strengthened the capacity of the Department of Higher Education to produce the kind of integrated system that Secretary Bialecki talked about, and also to specifically give us some tools to strengthen the role of public higher education in the workforce arena. So the challenge here is that we have a lot of work to do if we're going to have the best educated citizenry and workforce. The good news is we're on the case, and we have a lot of good things going on in that direction.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Brian, beat that.
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate the Commissioner for the report on the visiting project. Nothing wrong with the gentleman's C, but we need to get that increased. And I thought it would, just to get the community colleges, the state universities, and the University of Massachusetts together, smiling when you issued the report, and that's very well done. Perhaps you should become a diplomat as well. But there's no question that because of the role of public higher education, folks who tend to go there tend to stay here. That's very important to us long term as compared to students who might be at the private institutions, although we need both. As the Commissioner mentioned, there are a variety of projects and pilot programs underway, so I think it's a challenging and interesting time. There's no magic bullet to address or solve the issue of workforce training or in meeting future employment needs. But there are a couple of things that I'm particularly interested in. In the visiting report for public higher education, one of the issues of concern was that the students graduating from K through 12 system don't have necessarily the skills to really utilize their academic experience effectively. A lot of remediation going on and required, as well as might be a roadblock to actual graduation. We've been very much involved over the last 20 years with Mass Minister Alliance for Education and the whole K through 12 implementation of the reform systems. And As you know, we all work very hard to position the state to qualify for Race to the Top fundings to actually help provide federal funds to enhance teacher development. We believe that the best way to get increased performance of students is through effective teaching that can be measured and engaged and so forth. So I think that we can continue to cover on that and evaluate how that program is going. That may give us the opportunity to have students provide or obtain the STEM education or skills along with other academic issues in order to better utilize the public education program. Obviously, there's problems with financing and the access and so forth, but if the students coming out of K through 12 have the better tools to be more effective in the educational experience, that would be a home run. The second issue, I believe, was mentioned here, the Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative, which we're also interested in and participate in. There's a pilot program that the Massachusetts Manufacturing Expansion Partnership has developed with about 30 or 40 Central Mass manufacturers. They have come together to actually come up with 5 levels of education requirements, training requirements that could lead to a first year of credits toward an associate degree with Sigmund Community College, and then on beyond that, if necessary, at a bachelor's degree from Fitchburg State. Just to get 60 firms together who have agreed on some basic competencies as to what they need, as well as identifying the service delivery of those services, I think is a 10 strike. And we're very hopeful that the initial output and enthusiasm of these firms coming together with the help of MEP will be able to be utilized or replicated to one degree or another through other parts of the state. If we have been able to, the research that Dr. Bluestone has completed on manufacturing underscores that we're going to need 100,000 new manufacturing workers in the next decade to replace the folks who are retiring. We are high value. Every manufacturer here is high value added, is a high technology firm to one degree or another, regardless of what they make. And I believe that the majority of the workers in Massachusetts in manufacturing have a higher technology background or skills requirement than about any other state in the nation. So we too, from the manufacturing sector, have a very important interest in the success of having folks have the educational background in order to grow and meet future needs. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. And Nancy?
Batting cleanup. Good morning, everyone. I would also like to thank the Boston Foundation for hosting this, and I'd also like to thank the New England Public Policy Center, Robert, Darcy Sass, and Yolanda in particular for being really very generous partners in this effort. They've put a tremendous amount of work and effort into creating these profiles and taking it on the road. And as Robert and Yolanda said, we've done 7 summits so far, and we have the 8th at the Cape and Islands on December 18th. And at each one, we've gotten a good crowd. They've stayed the whole time, and they've engaged in some really interesting conversations. And there's no question that there are real regional differences in terms of the challenges that people face. And so regional approaches to really addressing those challenges is one important way to go. But there are also some statewide themes that I think we need to focus on, particularly with a backdrop of an aging workforce and an aging workforce in which we're going to see significant retirements in the next 5 to 10 years. The first one is youth unemployment. And as Robert pointed out, we've seen disproportionate unemployment among young workers. They make up 26% of the unemployed in this state, but only 13% of the labor force. Young workers are having a very difficult time finding entry ramps into employment. It's no longer enough to have a credential, even a credential from an elite university. What employers are looking for is work experience, and they're looking in particular for work experience in what they're hiring for. And so I think at this point we've done a lot of small programs to try to increase internships and co-ops and that sort of thing, but I think it's pretty clear that we need to integrate work experience into secondary and post-secondary programs in a very serious way in this state if we're going to ensure that our young workers have access to robust entry ramps and can begin to become productive workers, replacing baby boomers as they retire. The Secretary said we're getting to a point now where we can look in the long term. We're talking about 5 years from now when we're going to start seeing significant retirements, but we really haven't figured out this problem yet of how do we build robust entry ramps for young workers. The second theme is the theme around people with high school diplomas or less, and again, being disproportionately unemployed. This is very hard work because it takes a long time to get the skills and credentials you need to be able to access jobs in a very highly skilled economy that we have in Massachusetts. But we need to increase the scale and the number of programs that are connecting adult basic education and English as a second language to post-secondary education and are linked to employment, that are really sector-based and are really about training people for very specific industries, jobs, and help lead to employment outcomes. The third theme that's related to the second is diversity and immigration. As a state, when we grow because of immigration, we grow because of growth in diverse populations. The regions that have seen growth because of immigration and growth in diverse populations, and those who haven't grown is because they haven't really been able to attract immigrants. And we need to pay attention to diversity and immigration as we think through workforce solutions and how we're really working very hard to integrate new immigrants into our economy and our civic structures as quickly as we can. The last thing I want to say is one of the data points that Robert didn't talk about, but I think is an issue, is in this state we've seen a decline in part-time enrollments in bachelor's degree programs, and the U.S. has seen an increase in part-time enrollments in bachelor degree programs. And if we know, particularly in the greater Boston area, that increasingly bachelor's degrees are becoming an entry requirement for good jobs, we need to think about how we continue to improve part-time access to bachelor's degree programs so that people who do complete associate's degrees are able to access bachelor's degrees in ways that meet the needs of people who are probably also juggling work and family. And so I think those are really the themes that we've seen, the three themes that I think are probably the most troubling and the ones that we really need to pay attention to in the near future. Thank you.
Fantastic. We are back on schedule, which I think is pretty good. Let me just, before we open up for giving you a chance to finally talk and ask some questions, I think it's fascinating when I think over the last 5 years that 5 years ago we weren't talking about manufacturing in this state, nor were we talking about it in the nation. Not only is our governor talking about it, last State of the Union address, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, mentioned manufacturing 8 times and spent more time talking about that than foreign policy. We weren't talking about vocational education or community colleges 5 years ago. It's now top of our agenda. And while we were talking about housing, we weren't necessarily talking about workforce housing and the need to keep young people here in this kind of civil war between the regions in order to replace the aging workforce or the 100,000 job opportunities that we're going to see in manufacturing. And I'm reminded that if you go back 16 months ago, in August of 2011, the Boston Red Sox were considered possibly the best baseball team in the history of the major leagues. And if you go back just to September of this year, you would note that Notre Dame, now #1 in the nation in the BCS rankings, was not in the top 25 in the ratings at the beginning of the season. And what that reminds me is the need for constant vigilance. That in this global economy we have today, there is no way that you can stand pat. There's no way you can just sit around and, live off your successes of the past. That you constantly have to be meeting the challenges of the future, and you have to be doing it in both the short term and the long term. And the brilliance, I think, of the Commonwealth today, very different than the Commonwealth I came to see in 1971 when I arrived here from Detroit, Michigan, in Ann Arbor, is that we have built what my dear friend Paul Grogan calls the collaborative gene of bringing together the business community, the education community, the state, to work together, nonprofits and profits, to really address these issues. And we need to continue to do that despite how well we may think we're doing today. Recall the Red Sox, and remember there are teams out there like Notre Dame that we have to meet that challenge. Being average is no way we want to be there. So let's open it up. We have until about 10:25 for questions and answers, and let's start right here. Please identify yourself. Please.
My name is Issa Zimmerman.
There's a microphone coming, Edith.
I actually probably
I think it's on. Just
because I am used to speaking loudly. I'm a former high school principal and superintendent of schools. And that actually relates to the issue I want to raise, and particularly perhaps to Commissioner Freeland. An area that I see in my recent and past work that needs addressing is the preparation of teachers. We're not, I think in general, lots of exceptions, preparing our teachers to deal with the issues that are on the table here today, and particularly from the perspective of STEM. I'm a member of the Governor's STEM Advisory Council, particularly elementary teachers through whose fault it is not, they're not prepared in the STEM subjects. And if we don't start teaching our children early, particularly in those subjects, we lose another advantage that we've had for a long time. So I know it's very difficult, having also been at the university level for 10 years, to do that, but it seems to me that part of the entire picture that you're working with should include, so this is not a question, it's more of a comment, should include looking at teacher preparation. And happy to make it into a question, are we doing anything that we should be? Thank you.
Richard?
Yes, it's a critically important focus, and it is something we are working on, and it is also something where, like you, we don't have the solution yet, but we know we need to get there. I think the context for our work right now is the fact that Massachusetts has signed up for the Common Core standards, and that is going to require us to raise the level of our game in terms of math and English, but math in particular related to STEM. And it's not clear, it's pretty clear that we are not producing the teachers out of our teacher-ed programs that are prepared to teach the Common Core standards. So it is that focus that we are working with each of our public state universities in particular to make sure that we're going to be ready on the Common Core standards. So it's a significant focus of our work.
If I could just add one thing which isn't directly about teacher education, but I think has potential for revolutionizing our K through 12 education. Beginning with a report that I happen to be one of the co-authors with Tom Hoken of MIT through the Boston Foundation, the Grand Bargain Report. We've now created the Massachusetts Education Partnership, which had its initial meeting with 300 local union teacher representatives, superintendents, and school committee chairs in Marlborough just on Monday, to create an entire new approach for teachers, administrators, and the community to work together to improve our schools. We had 300 people at the original meeting from all over the Commonwealth, and I think that is also going to focus a lot on professional development of teachers, how we do evaluation of teachers to improve their teaching in the classroom, and their approach to teaching in the community. So stay tuned to that as well. Another question. Back here. Please introduce yourself. Wait, it's actually,
okay.
You need the mic.
My name is Tony Alka. I run a grassroots organization called Future Chefs, which deals with young people who are at risk of being left behind after high school. And my question is going to get a little granular, but I'm very concerned that here in the Boston region, we have the worst vocational technical high school in the state. And that is not of concern for all of us. There's a corresponding problem with violence in the corridor that's related to kids who could be doing really well in that school. And I think, you know, the Pathways to Prosperity report prompted an assessment of that school. The mayor called for it to become an innovation school, but there is no community wraparound to insist that that process go forward, and it's failing. And it's not acceptable, so I'd like to know what you all think about that.
Anyone here? Richard?
I can tell you that there is a significant focus on that school and the need to make it more successful than it is. There's a shared perception that we need a much higher level of performance out of the school, and current discussions about are there ways we can create partnerships, for example, between that school and the community colleges and universities in the system to make a more robust workforce-oriented educational program.
Brian?
As an example, I think that the two vocational schools in the state have shown progress over the years because community involvement and partnerships, as the Commissioner referred to. The Worcester Vocational Technical High School got very strong support for the new facility. And, you know, most businesses don't want to spend money and don't have to, but also they raise public sector funds for matching equipment and continued involvement in the curriculum and development and recruitment of students into specialized high school programs. And the same is being done now in Springfield, at the vocational school in Springfield. The key, I think, is somehow to get the employers who would benefit from this involved from the get-go, and in order to give it some visibility in the community.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. Over here.
Priscilla Douglas. My question is, how does the online learning, edX, Khan Academy, how does all of that fit into providing access to people?
Richard, do you want to take a crack at online education? And then maybe Nancy?
Not an area that I'm an expert in, but I have been involved with edX. It's a fantastic thing. I think everybody knows that this is a Harvard-MIT initiated project, but it's now drawing in partner institutions from all across public higher education, ranging just this past week from Wellesley College at one end to two of our community colleges at the other end. But the notion is that edX is creating a platform by which very high quality courses can be offered to massive numbers of people. The early experimental course developed by MIT had 150,000 people enrolled in it worldwide, of whom something like 15,000 actually finished the course. So the notion is to use a technological platform which has been developed in edX and make it widely and cheaply available to vast numbers of people. And then at the next declension, to partner with different types of institution, ranging from a community college to a four-year selective institution like Wellesley, to see how that platform can be tweaked and adapted to serve the needs of those different kinds of institutions. So we have Bunker Hill and Mass Bay, for example, in our community college, working with edX to develop hybrid systems by which the courseware that edX has developed online can be used in conjunction with brick and mortar instruction at the community college level to build a stronger educational program. So I think we are witnessing a huge revolution in how education is delivered, probably through some kind of partnership between these big online operations and local brick and mortar operations, and that's what edX stands for.
Nancy?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I think that that's going to be a really important part of the workforce solutions, in particular for people who really need a more convenient platform and a flexible platform in which to be able to pursue learning. And they have really, I think, paid attention to the metrics around whether or not people are learning, and there's a lot of sort of metrics that you can use to measure, you know, what people are struggling with. But I think it's a really important part of the solution around how we help people gain the skills they need, particularly working adults. And I think it's also a way of bringing some of the STEM learning into schools where we may not have teacher expertise, but that those platforms exist and can be customized for different kinds of learners. And I think given the fact that edX is local, we should really be working very hard with them to continue to try to influence the way they develop these in ways that help us solve these problems. But I think it's going to be a very important part of the way we solve these challenges.
You know, I'm very happy to hear Richard talk about this, because as a teacher for now 42 years, I want to be able to use all of these online tools, and we're developing them very, very rapidly at Northeastern, where I work. But what I'm convinced of, from my own personal experience, it's the combination of having these online tools, but also the bricks and mortar working together. That is, there is something still to the old-fashioned classroom of being able to get people together with a good instructor to review what they're doing. There's lots of things we can do much more efficiently particularly in terms of getting our finest lecturers and finest teachers up on the web. But there's also something about that interaction which really seals that knowledge into your head. And that's how the neural networks work, and that's what we're doing. You want to follow up?
Yes, thank you. Well, the main thing is that it's free. And the other part is that for that gap for students who can't, who need to get their skills up, the remediation piece, they can go online for free and then go to a brick and mortar,
right.
You know, then go to school. So it's, that's one opportunity.
Mr. Grogan.
This is for Richard, but I'd invite comments from Brian and Nancy as well. You referred to the governor's rather sweeping legislation that particularly focused on community colleges, pushing it more in the direction of being a real system, far more attuned to workforce needs than it has been. What are going to be the crucial steps to realizing the promise of that legislation?
I think the crucial step crucial first step, I think, has been taken, and that is to really connect local governing boards to the state in a much more robust way. I think one of the things that has happened that has fed into the decentralization and disaggregation of the system that Barry referred to is that each of our public campuses at the state university and community college level have local boards of trustees with large delegated authority. And historically, once we've appointed them, we've just kind of left them on our own, and on their own. And I think what we've realized as we've looked at this workforce initiative is that we can't do that anymore. We need to wire them into a robust statewide system. One of the reforms was gave the governor the power to appoint chairs of community college boards. That's a big step. He has done that. He's exercised that power. He's appointed, I think, 6 or 7 new chairs. He's convened those chairs just within the last 10 days. He said to them, we need you to be thinking about the state at the same time you're thinking about your local responsibilities, and we need you to be part of, for example, the kind of thing that the Vision Project represents, which is a statewide strategic plan for higher education. So, and we were also given tools in the budget at the Department of Higher Education to be in more active communication with those local boards and to convene them periodically and help them understand what the state is trying to accomplish. So at the level of the governance of those institutions, I think there's been significant change to get them more into a system. And then at the campus level, the operational level, we need a statewide strategic plan that the campuses are all part of, and that's really what the Vision Project represents. So I think the combination of the new governance changes and the strategic planning at the campus level are starting to get us there, Paul.
Brian?
One of the things that was in the community college bill was a sum of small money, I think of like $2 million, that if, in fact, an economic development opportunity came in for a sizable manufacturer to come in or other kind of firm where there was some training needed, that there was some resources available for coming up with a program and funding it rather than scurrying around and trying to post things together. So I think if there's an ex-Bristol-Myers Squibb that's going to locate in Massachusetts or some other kind of large organization that would have an economic impact to a region, it would be great to see that being able to be utilized and responded to in a timely manner. The second thing that I'm very excited about when Mary Beth was talking about the regional opportunities for the community colleges and the economic development agencies and the workforce development boards to work more closely together. In the regional, in the rural areas, there aren't a lot of industry and aren't a lot of businesses. But if they can take an inventory of the skills of the potential workers or the populations that are there, then I think the next strategic step is to see how that recruits the economic development activities for either helping to foster those industries to be developed or whatever. For example, in the Pioneer Valley, besides metal machinery, I'm thinking of software, knowledge contents programs. They do call it the information corridor. I remember when I worked in Hartford in the 70s, there was more computing power in Hartford alone than any place in the country. So why that hasn't developed into a software industry like it has in Cambridge is a question to be answered. Lower cost of doing business, requires STEM education, but those kinds of things might be very possible when you put the whole thing together.
Barry, can I say one thing quickly about that?
Please.
Is as we've done these summits, the community college presidents have all been there, and they've all come up afterward, and it's very clear, I think, that they are hungry for information, and I would say maybe technical assistance around how you connect better with businesses. In a couple of regions, I think when you look at the fields of study and what's happened over a 10-year period, there are a couple of regions where I think there's been a lot of work around alignment, and we could probably learn from those regions. And the last thing I want to say is Greenfield Community College actually was at the Pioneer Valley event, and there was also a business person there who had attended Green Jobs associate's degree program at Greenfield. And there's actually an industry growing around that in Greenfield, and it was funded with a Workforce Competitiveness Trust Fund grant a few years ago, and he's hired people from that program. So I think it's an example of what you're talking about. But I do think that there's a real realization and a hunger now for, okay, how do we make this happen?
Greg, you will have the last comment. Why don't you grab the mic?
Just add, since Paul Grogan was nice enough to lay up a softball question like that, that I think the commissioner would agree also that in terms of important next steps in the coming budget this year, one piece of business is going to come up is a funding formula for the community colleges. That was a piece of the governor's proposed reform last year that you may remember. The legislature asked Commissioner Freeland to lead a commission to look more carefully at the subject, and he's done a wonderful job in bringing all the stakeholders together. But we will be having a new funding proposal in the coming budget, which will shockingly, will focus on the idea that budgeting ought to be based on performance and incentives rewards for performance. So that's going to be a very important conversation in the legislature in the spring, and we're going to need all your help with that. But as you will soon be seeing, Commissioner Freeland has really worked with a lot of stakeholders to lay, we think, is a great foundation for a new way to think about funding the community colleges that rewards performance, adds resources, but does guide them based on performance.
Well, I want to thank our panel, Richard Freeland, Brian Gilmore, Nancy Schneider, and I'd like to call up to the podium for closing remarks my dear friend John Hamill.
Thank you. Nice to see you're going to be at this building. Well, I hope, good morning, I'm John Hamill, and I hope that you have the same feeling as I sat here, that we really are in good hands. To have the kind of presentation, Robert, that you did to start it off, Yolanda, by introducing the forum and having someone like Robert come and give us as much information as he did, to be followed up, of course, by Greg, who has been a stalwart in his ability to both understand and make things happen in the state government. Mary Beth, who I had not met before, but obviously has her hands in a lot of different pies. Then Barry, who is, if not a stalwart, is the Rock of Gibraltar, I'd say, as it relates to these kinds of seminars. And Richard, who I've known for forever here in Massachusetts, and his prior incarnation here and at UMass Boston, then down in New York and back here. And Brian, who I've known forever, but I must say, impressively, kind of dancing around the state with a business hat on and in and out of the different high schools and knowing what's going on, it comes through very clearly. And Nancy, who doing the regional work. So all of you, I think this is a very keen awareness on the part of business, on the part of education, higher ed, the way in which we have to go forward with the state to make good things happen. So I applaud you all, because it's not easy work, and it's work that sometimes I think people think is easy to make happen, but as we've all seen with the community college question, which, by the way, started right here, and congratulations to Paul and to the whole group that assembled here and talked about this question of community colleges and how are the community colleges going to become a more effective force, because we know they're so important, but how are they going to become a more effective force? And that's what happened as a result of conversations that started here, resulted in legislation, and now that legislation has become a critical part of the discussion that is going to create a better system. The other thought I had as I was sitting listening, you know, it seems like we have an overarching theme always, or a couple of themes. One, especially in this country and the state, between centralization and decentralization. I happened to, a few years back, be going around to the different chambers to talk about one of the initiatives that I've been involved with regard to local aid, and I happened to hit each of the chambers for South Shore, Metro West, Merrimack Valley, and Boston when their boards were meeting to talk about their strategic plan. So I was going to 4 different regions, and Yolanda, this addresses a little bit your first question that you posed to us about what do you think about, and Richard, the various breakdowns in these regional approaches. And I expected to hear about the regional differences between all. They had 5 major priorities. Each of them had the same 5 major priorities. It was leading into the big dig and the question of Logan and all the rest. But they each, and went on from there with regard to education and all, they all had the same 5. And I thought, you know, this is a little strange. I'm in 5 different quote-unquote regions, all have unique attributes, but all of them had their 5 major priorities being the same. Now, having said that, to try to say that they should all merge, which some in the business community thought might be a good idea because, you know, 5 different, that doesn't work. But at the same time, to have all of them working on the same 5 priorities with 5 different groups all coming up with the best, quote-unquote, best plan to affect those things seemed obviously counterintuitive. So then, and I think we have the same issue in some respects here. As we look at the breakdown of the regions, yes, there are some differences, but mainly there are similarities, I would argue, and that knowing where the similarities are and making sure that we are bringing the best thinking, and going now to the question of the community colleges, the best thinking from the statewide perspective, as opposed to getting tied up in our localness, is, I think, obviously the thing to do. But teasing out where the localness is appropriate. And I think you find this especially in the Cape and Islands, the Worcester, and the West, where you have that difference, because they're not, I mean, instinctively don't think of them as being Boston, even though they are affected by Boston. Right. You know that we need to tease that out. But without giving up the central theme of how we're going to make most effective use of the resources that we have and that legislation that was done, I think, does that. I think it also, Mary Beth, as I listened to her, I think I came away with the notion that she's trying to do that so that there is a more inclusive work across the regions on the strategic planning that is being done, so that we're not reinventing the wheel in each of those areas and then using up important resources. So I would say that, and lastly, going back to the point that was made, Richard, with the 16 to 24-year-olds, 19% of that cohort is unemployed. It goes back to the question of, perhaps, Issa, to your question or your point about the teacher training. A lot of this starts way before getting to the college level. It rather means that if we don't have these kids educated coming to get out of high school, just to get out of high school. Doesn't mean that they're going to be great, but they need remediation. But if they don't get out of high school, we've got, I think, Richard, you said 20 or 30,000 in that cohort, means that some number along, a large number of kids who are unemployed forever or underemployed forever. They're never going to make it up. So in this most educated state, we're never going to get it perfectly, but I think that's a number that should come down. It's a high number. When we read about that kind of an unemployment number in Spain or in Europe and other places, we say, oh my God, that's terrible, and yet we have it right here in that cohort. And not only does it create a problem with regard to employment, but it has all of the other socioeconomic costs associated with that kind of unemployment that will result in higher crime rates, higher drug rates, higher birth rates, unwed you name it, which is billions of dollars worth of cost, if you will, if you spread that across the country, but certainly in this state, a lot of stuff. So I think this has been an extremely useful and important conversation, which is going to go on, as was indicated. On March the 14th, we'll be looking at best practices from elsewhere, community colleges with regard to, and workforce development. That's March 14th. And on May 30th, putting it all together, the focus on the next steps, creating the education and workforce development ideas that come from all of the discussions that are going on. So thank you for attending this morning, and thank you again to all of the participants and to the foundation, Paul, and the whole crowd, doing great work, even with broken legs and bad ankles and all the rest. Thank you very much. Bye now. Thanks, Brian. That was great.